Hello, everyone who has joined us today. We have a very important topic to discuss, the prospects for arms race and nuclear non-proliferation in the Middle East. Oh, Riccardo is back. Hi. So, and we chose actually somewhat a broader topic because we have already discussed nuclear negotiations and the revival of JCPOA. And of course, I know that the ongoing situation is not very clear to focus only on the JCPOA. So I want this discussion to be more based on what we can see for the future of the Middle East in terms of whether or not the deal is going to succeed and whether or not there are hopes for a revival. Regardless of that, how can we predict the future? How can we, whether we can foresee a kind of more optimistic future, more peaceful one, or whether it's going to be a kind of intensified, let's say, arms race or escalation of tensions potentially. And so we have actually in the topics, we have three subtopics. First, about the role of the international institutions and regimes, mostly the IAEA and obviously the institutions such as the Troika, the European powers, and the role of great powers such as the US, Russia, China, what role they may play, especially considering the Ukraine war, and which has turned out to be a kind of unexpected factor in this whole dynamics. And also talk about more in terms of not only nuclear non-proliferation, but also arms race, especially as we have witnessed, for example, Biden's Middle East trip. We have other trips by leaders of other countries such as Putin and the others to countries in the region. So with that introduction, and obviously I forgot to introduce our institute. I'm sure you are familiar to Riccardo, but just for anyone who has joined us and is not aware, our institute has started working for the past 6 or 7 years, and we focus on the US and European countries' foreign policy with regards to Iran and broader Middle Eastern issues. And my colleagues are from the two departments of the US department, the US program, and the European countries program, France, the UK, Germany, and the EU. So we look forward to your presentation, to your talks and comments. With that introduction, the floor is yours, Daniela.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting us today. It is really at a really important time. I think there is a high uncertainty that is, on the one hand, of course, related to the fate of the JCPOA. I think the Europeans are in a last-ditch effort to somehow save it, but my general reading is, or I don't have so many expectations anymore, because I think that the kind of commitment that Iran needs from the US to the deal is what the US cannot actually give. So in a way, unfortunately, I think the former Trump administration has locked us into this situation where the deal is not going to likely happen. I hope I'm wrong, and maybe in the next few weeks we will know more. But there is also larger uncertainty in the whole international system, of course, with the with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think these exchanges are really important, and clearly in our institute we are very much committed to these exchanges. So the Instituto Affari Internazionali here in Rome is one of Italy's leading foreign policy think tanks. We work on various issues on the European Union, on global actors that is the Global Actors Program, which is led by Riccardo Alcaro, who is also head of research at IAIO, and who is here today. Then we have, of course, the Mediterranean, Middle East, and Africa program, which I'm responsible for. And we deal with energy issues, with defense and security issues. So we cover all kinds of issues that are, of course, important from a European perspective. And for years, our institute has been very much engaged in following issues surrounding the JCPOA. So last week, we actually hosted the Iranian foreign minister in our institute for a closed-door discussion as well. So first of all, thank you very much for this exchange. And without further ado, I start my short presentation. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see.
Okay. So I was asked to speak about the implications of the nuclear deal negotiations for the arms race in the region. So I mainly focus on that, but I do focus a lot on international institutions and regimes, given that this is one of my major research areas, actually. So when thinking about this question, I first thought we need to say what actually is this arms race about, and there are actually diverse but interlinked arms races in the Middle East. So one concerns weapons of mass destruction. The second is conventional arms. Then there is ballistic missiles, which are conventional arms, but can be equipped with weapons of mass destruction. And then I also put into this first part of my presentation external actors, Russia and the US in particular, given that they are actors which are in the Middle East with military forces too. And the final point I also want to look at here are alliances, and I would put them more onto the side of the arms race rather than on the side of collective security, because these alliances usually are part of these arms races because they're meant to provide a degree of deterrence. And then in the last part of my presentation, I will look into talks towards a sustainable and inclusive security architecture in the region. So of course, the JCPOA, which was supposed to be an important building stone in that respect, but also the UN-led talks for weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, and the Baghdad talks. So to start with the arms race, I think first we need to look into the issue of weapons of mass destructions, and we need to look at all of these weapons in one picture. So it's not only nuclear, but nuclear is very clearly linked to chemical arms as well. And as you can see here on this map regarding the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it is clear that there are only some regions in this world where the picture remains very destabilizing. And one of these pictures is, of course, the Middle East. Of course, in the NPT, Israel is a non-signatory, and Iran is a nuclear threshold state. However, nuclear weapons have actually never been used, and the same actually applies to the biological weapons. But still, to have a look at the convention here, you can see the non-signatories, which are Israel. The Biological Weapons Convention has been signed, but not ratified by Egypt and Syria. Again, however, this here isn't very, if you look at practice, the actual problem sits because biological weapons, again, haven't really been used. So the real problem sits in the Chemical Weapons Convention when it comes to the Middle East. And you can see that it's one of the only regions in the world where there is a big problem when it comes to chemical arms. So the Chemical Weapons Convention, Israel has signed but not ratified it. And then Egypt refuses to sign the Chemical Arms Convention as long as Israel does not sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to have kind of a deterrent structure in that respect here too. So it, of course, refuses to sign this even following the Camp David Accords. The same has been true for Syria and Iraq. With the same argument, actually. So as long as Israel doesn't sign the NPT, they won't sign. However, under pressure, Iraq entered the Chemical Arms Convention in 2009, and it has been verified destruction of its chemical weapons in 2018. Now, we all know that Syria, under pressure, signed the convention in 2013, declared the destruction of its program in 2014, but the OPCW, the agency responsible for confirming the elimination of this program, cannot confirm it. So here is where the real problem sits. Chemical arms have been widely used in the Middle East, both in interstate war. Of course, Iraq has used it against Iran, but also in intrastate war. So they have been widely used in Syria, for example. Now, other problems related to chemical arms is that some arms like chlorine gas are not listed under convention, and other arms like white phosphorus also remain legal under this convention, and they are actually widely used. The US used phosphorus in Iraq, and Israel has used it both against Gaza and southern Lebanon. So this is one picture where there is a clear problem that needs to be solved. And so we will speak about these weapons of mass destruction again when we look into international negotiations in that aspect. Now, to come more to the conventional arms race in the region, this picture by CIPRI is quite telling. So this shows the arms imports by the Arab states of the Persian Gulf and by Iran. And what you can see here is two important things. One is the shift. If you look at the period before the Arab uprisings and the period after the Arab uprisings, there is an incredible increase of arms exports by the GCC states after the Arab uprisings, whereas the same does not happen. Iran's arms imports are not comparable in that respect. That is because of the sanctions, of course, and Iran cannot invest in its aircraft. So here, what we can see is that in terms of aircraft, Israel remains best equipped, followed by Saudi Arabia increasingly. Now, if we look more closely into these arms exports, which are also interesting when thinking about the JCPOA, actually, of Saudi Arabia, what we can see here in this graph is an increase, particularly after 2013. So that is, of course, related to augmenting geopolitical rifts in the region. So on the one hand, in the Persian Gulf, but importantly, actually, given that this happens particularly after 2013, this is also related to the increasing confrontation with political Islam and Qatar and Turkey in that respect in the GCC, actually. However, it's also important to understand how closely this is connected to US policy, actually. So for the Saudis, particularly after 2011, they had a clear perception that there was a US foreign policy shift because their perception was that Obama dropped Mubarak on one hand, and that Obama opened up to Iran with the JCPOA. Now, what is interesting, if we look at these arms imports, is that they are incredibly high, both during the JCPOA being in action and after Trump actually pulling out of the JCPOA. So these high Saudi arms imports do not directly correlate with what is happening on the JCPOA front, even though obviously they are related to what the JCPOA means. What is also important to remember, I think, for the Saudis is that arms exports to Saudi Arabia have become increasingly questioned in the US Congress and in EU member states' parliaments, and that has been closely related to the war on Yemen, of course. So if following also civil society actions in Europe, where, for example, Italian trade unions refused to load arms on ships in Italian harbors to be shipped to Saudi Arabia and to be used in Yemen. So there is a lot of civil society action going on, and which is closely related to Saudi Arabia and its actions in Yemen. Final point on Saudi Arabia is that it cannot import its ballistic missiles from the US. So there is some arms that Israel is blocking the US to sell to GCC states. And so the Saudis are actually importing them from China, mainly also to actually start to build a domestic infrastructure to produce them. Now, of course, to remain with ballistic missiles, that is clearly where an arms race is happening. So in ballistic missiles and drones. And I think, well, for Europeans, you know this much better, but Europeans often do not understand that for Iran, the main deterrents are ballistic missiles, given that it cannot invest in because of the sanctions in aircraft. And so it's a crucial pillar, of course, of its asymmetric deterrence strategy with missiles, drones, cyber, and non-state actor alliances. Now, if we look at the current situation, then Iran has built the largest and most diverse arsenal, and Israel is most technically advanced and can arm ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads. And Syria and Egypt, I think I should mention here too, can arm theirs, of course, with chemical weapons. Now to look a little bit at external actors and their role in the region. So this picture is from 2020, so that is before the pullout of NATO forces from Afghanistan, of course. But I think what is important is simply that it shows how dominant the US remains in the region, even though it is very clear that it actually wants to pull out. Now, it's not going to simply pull out, obviously. I mean, I think it is clear that since the Obama administration, the US has a need to focus, geopolitically speaking, at least that is what, let's say, the security establishment believes, to focus on China and now, of course, Russia again. So I think there have been two ways of thinking about this in the US. So one US strategy was the idea of starting to bind Iran into a regional security architecture. And the other one is to build a regional alliance which would contain Iran. And so, of course, the first one has been the Obama approach, which is quite important to remember that it was a quite important departure from previous US administration policies. So if we think about the Clinton administration and dual containment, or the Bush administration and the kind of rhetoric that it built, that was, of course, all built up around containing Iran, whereas, of course, Obama did part from that kind of approach with the idea that the JCPOA would be a first stepping stone towards a more inclusive regional security architecture. Of course, the Trump administration abandoned that, as we all know, and has invested heavily into building a regional alliance to contain Iran. So that on the one hand, and then of course Russia should be mentioned here too, which is an increasingly important actor in the region, even though it has much more of an ad hoc strategy, except for in Syria, of course, where it is very present with forces. Now to speak a bit about these kind of alliances, which are part of deterrence, I think there are two different types of alliances in the region. One is Iran's deep relations with non-state actors in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And these relations appear quite stable, even if there are differences at times, but they are rather stable. And the other kind of alliance that is emerging is, of course, based in these kind of normalization deals between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. It is very clear that these are deterrence alliances if we just look into the kind of arms deals which they also imply. Now, what is interesting is that the Biden administration has pursued both paths in a way, Obama and Trump paths at the same time. That is, I think, connected to the Biden administration not actually having any vision for the region. I think if anyone read before Biden now departed to the Middle East, his op-ed on the Washington Post, it is void of any kind of vision, security vision for the region. So he just continued on these two paths. And on the JCPOA negotiations on the one hand, and on the other hand, trying to foster these kind of normalization deals as well. So there are ongoing talks of this kind of what is called Arab NATO between Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Jordan, Egypt, the UAE, and Bahrain. That talks mainly surround the idea of an air defense alliance. However, at this current point, there are mainly talks. Now, I also think that while in the short or medium term, something might materialize here, I think that this kind of structure is not sustainable so much in the longer term. Why? Because if we look, for example, at NATO, yes, so the US European alliance, that is, of course, an alliance which is built amongst democracies which trust each other. And I think that the same clearly doesn't happen when we look at this kind of alliance between Israel and some Arab states. Israel doesn't trust these states fully. For example, it continues to block certain arms deals to Arab states because it fears what would actually happen if there was a democratic regime, for example. Clearly, the foreign policy of Saudi Arabia would look quite different. So that there is no trust on the side of Israel vis-a-vis these states. And the same can be said of the Arab states. I think most of the societies which have been surveyed in this period of normalization deals do not trust Israel because of the ongoing Palestine question. So over the longer term, I think this alliance doesn't appear to me so sustainable, like NATO, for example, is. Okay, so much, let's say, about this bigger picture about arms and deterrence. And now let's look into what can actually be done towards building a security architecture in the region. And the JCPOA has, of course, been a crucial stepping stone related to nuclear non-proliferation and a regional security architecture, but the JCPOA by itself would have never been enough for the Middle East. That's quite clear. I think that the JCPOA has its own independent value, absolutely, when it comes to nuclear non-proliferation. But for the region, I think it has become quite clear that the arms race also sits on other issues. So it's not enough to just invest in the JCPOA. I think the most crucial, I see much more crucial than the JCPOA, I would say, are the Baghdad talks between Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the Emirates. So these talks, why? Because they're regionally led. So they make sure that the process is actually locally owned and is not based on what external powers and their interests in the region. So I think these talks are crucial. And I would like to highlight again also the crucial role of Iraq in that respect. It's very clear that the Arab region is very much divided right now, and this Arab division has been a problem for Iran as well. I think that's very clear if we look at this kind of Arab NATO idea. I think we can see how harmful actually this division of the Arab world is for regional security at large in the region. So I think the idea of restoring Arab unity is also crucial, and Iraq can play a crucial role in this. I think that right now there is no Arab lead state. Yeah, so if we look at this historically, there has been Egypt for a long time, which has been in the lead, and then after the Camp David Treaty in Iraq, Saudi Arabia took over. Right now, there is no kind of lead of an Arab state with soft power, enough soft power to unite the Arab world again. And I think that Iraq could actually play such a role. So I think this idea of Iraq as a regional mediator is quite crucial in that respect for regional security. So that on the regional security framework. And then the UN-led talks on a weapon of mass destruction-free zone, and that connects to the first part of my presentation, which are extremely crucial as well. Now, these talks were first introduced in the UN General Assembly in '74 by Egypt and Iran. Then in 1990, there was the Mubarak Initiative. So Egypt has been quite pushing this forward, actually. So the argument of that initiative was that we need to connect the whole spectrum of weapons of mass destruction. So not only nuclear, but we need to connect it to the chemical arms too. And this kind of initiative tried to include all 22 states of the Arab League plus Iran and Israel. And then, of course, the newest initiative happened in 2018, UN General Assembly Resolution 73546 for convening a conference to negotiate such a weapons of mass destruction free zone. And this is actually ongoing. So their first session was in 2019, a second in 21, a third is going to happen in November 2022. And there have also been ongoing workshops actually in that respect between the Arab states and Iran. Now, the US and Israel decline attendance with the typical argument that first there needs to be peace, then disarmament. While obviously if we look at such talks in other regions of the world, it is always that talks on disarmament come together with leading eventually to peace. However, as I said, actually the negotiations between the Arab states and Iran are ongoing in that respect. So I think I would leave it here. I hope I touched the most important issues and leave the rest for discussion.
Thank you, Daniela. Thank you very much. It was very informative and comprehensive. During your talk, I actually had one question which you, while speaking about it, you said your prediction and your analysis. So I'm not going to repeat that about, you mentioned the issue of the pullout, US pullout from Afghanistan and how it has changed the dynamics in the region. But I was going to also raise this question about, you very briefly mentioned imports of weapons from China by the regional actors. And we have all these players, US, Russia, and we have somehow witnessed a kind of reduced presence of the US in the region, somehow let's say offshoring this the responsibility to the regional actors. But again, we are witnessing perhaps a renewed interest in the Middle East after the Ukrainian war, Russia-Ukraine war, and we are witnessing more competition, more great power competition to somehow build up the region's security alliances, and this could escalate tensions possibly. Especially if the deal is not going to be revived. And I also have a question about, so actually comment more, but a question about whether or not you see chances of countries like Saudi Arabia becoming nuclear states, and as they are building in that direction. And okay, for now, so far, just this one, okay. And Riccardo, I see he's raised his hand, okay. Would you like to add to the comments?
Yes, but after Daniela's response to your questions.
Okay, sure. Then,
yes, yes, you're right. I think about this, the impact of the US-led, I always say this, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I don't know what's wrong. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine has an important impact on the US in a way, of course, but renewing its alliance maybe with GCC states. But I think more than being about the US, which is much more towards a road towards being energy self-sufficient, it's really about the Europeans becoming much more dependent on the GCC states again. So we have seen that immediately with the onset of the war, various European politicians immediately going to the GCC states. However, at the same time, for the Europeans, this also meant that they do have an increased interest again in making sure the JCPOA works. Now, with the JCPOA failing, then of course, for the Europeans, the GCC states will even have more importance again. So that I do agree. And I think what also already happened before the Ukraine war was that the Brexit, UK exit from the European Union had quite an impact on that too, in particular on the UK becoming much more closely aligned with the GCC states again. So I think actually this is more about Europe becoming more dependent on these states than the US. And I think in the US, what instead we have seen now with the recent Biden trip to the region was that domestically, there has been a lot of contestation in the US of his trip, and him not being able to insist on the human rights issue, on the issue of the Khashoggi murder, etc. So that about the first question, and then about the US, the Saudis becoming a nuclear state. Well, I think there are several considerations to be taken into consideration here. One is that it takes a lot of scientific research, etc., to actually arrive at that point. And I think the assessment generally is that Saudi Arabia doesn't have that potential right now. So it would actually need to import the technology because it can't build it by itself. Now the question is who would be willing to provide that kind of technology and know-how, etc. It's certainly not going to be the US. As I said before, they don't even send ballistic missiles to the Saudis. They will certainly not send them nuclear arms. And I think also the other powers are probably quite hesitant in that respect. There have been talks about maybe Pakistani technology and know-how. So these are talks that are ongoing, and of course they will be ongoing, I imagine. But I don't think this is going to happen in the near future. I think then we need to look more into the medium and longer term.
Yes, thank you. Well, of course, that makes quite so much sense, because the US is not in favor of creating a kind of rivalry in terms of nuclear weapons. But I was just raising this question in order to see whether the prospects of failure in negotiations would create some concerns in regional actors to go into that direction, and perhaps, as you mentioned, importing from Pakistan or other I don't know, powers, regional powers or great powers, and or maybe perhaps the US changing its mind to create a kind of balance of some sort. Tell us more about that.
Yes, no, I totally agree. I think this is an important question to ask. Now, generally, I think if we look into who has been going for nuclear arms, it's not always only related to a nuclear arms race. I think there is a lot of domestic factors which also need to be taken into consideration. If we look at Egypt, for example, yes, Egypt had all the incentives with Israel acquiring the bomb in the 50s, Egypt had all the incentives to also go for a nuclear bomb in the 50s. But they have decided domestically that they would not. So I think you're right. And the Saudis have also said that. I don't know if it's just rhetoric or if they really want to go into that direction. The risk clearly is there, I think, particularly if the JCPOA fails. But the risk is there anyways, because a nuclear power sits in the Middle East. So
yes, so that would create a kind of more incentive for working towards a more sustainable JCPOA, perhaps one that Iran could also see the commitments by the US and be sure of not a repetition of, I don't know, Trump's withdrawal. Yeah, because I have another question which is related to the US elections, but I would like to hear Riccardo's comments first.
Thank you, Fatemeh, and thank you so much to you and Iran-Eurica for inviting us over. As you may well guess by the state of my voice, I've not been doing well in these past few days. I've been down with COVID for 3 days now, and yesterday I was too weak to prepare a presentation, and I have a sore throat right now. My throat is really aching, so I'm not sure.
Thank you for accepting.
No,
in spite
look,
of this condition.
I'm actually feeling much better today in terms of the strength I feel in my body, but the throat is the problem. I'm not sure I can speak for long, so I would like to apologize to you and all the other members for not being able to make a proper presentation, but I hope I can contribute to the debate by building upon what Daniela said during her presentation and what you and Daniela were discussing about. Specifically, what I would like to do right now is to trace a link between the war in Ukraine and the much reduced room for nuclear diplomacy in the Middle East and the Gulf we're seeing right now. There is a connection. It's not a direct connection, but there is a connection. And I have to say that this war has made everything in international politics harder, and it will continue to do so for the reasons I will explain in a second. So let me go telegraphically, item by item. So I might jump a bit from one statement to another statement without properly making the argument for justifying the jump. I can do that perhaps later on. It's just that I do not want to be too long. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine is transforming the European security landscape. And one of the most important implications is that the asymmetry in the transatlantic relationship between the United States and the European states has now again taken on an existential nature for a number of European states. Not all European countries, but several European countries, at least half of them, I think, now see the security guarantees extended by the United States, not just as an insurance, as they've always seen them, but as a matter of existential protection, because they do fear that Russia, if not stopped, if not curbed, might contemplate the idea of intervening militarily in other countries, perhaps even in NATO countries. So the bottom line here, and I am oversimplifying, but the bottom line here is that the war has made the Europeans even more dependent on the United States than they were before. Second, the war has created, while limited to Europe, the war is having global implications for a number of reasons. The most obvious ones being the energy crisis and the food crisis, which are affecting many other countries outside of Europe. Actually, they're having a global impact, but there is more to that. The United States and the Europeans have isolated Russia, but they have isolated Russia from themselves. So Russia is now isolated from the West and from America's allies in the Asia Pacific. But this is, in terms of numbers, not that many countries. The majority of countries in the world have refused to join the isolation of Russia for a number of reasons. Most important one being that they do not want to be drawn into what they see as a conflict between NATO or the United States and its allies on the one hand, and Russia on the other hand. The most important countries here are China in the first place, which has not reneged on its partnership with Russia, but also India, which, in spite of getting closer to the United States in these past few years, does not want to align its foreign policy with that of the United States on such an important issue as the relationship with Russia. This has consequences for the European countries because at the global level, what we are seeing is that there is, the logic of competition, which is now dominant in the, of binary competition, which is now dominant in Europe, does have an effect also on a global stage. Countries, even though they do not want to be drawn to one side or the other of the conflict, will be constantly face the issue of whether going along the US desiderata, the US wishes, or resisting and defying the United States on Russia and also on China, because the war has made also tensions between the Western countries and China more acute. For the Europeans, this means that they face an international global system which is more competitive, more volatile, less reliable. And in as much as it is less reliable, they will have to rely on countries that are perceived to be friendlier or strategically more aligned. And countries that are strategically more aligned to the Europeans are countries that are strategically more aligned to the Europeans because they are closer to the United States. And among these, as Daniela was saying, certainly I would include the GCC countries. This means that the Europeans are not just more dependent on the United States for their security, but the Europeans are also more dependent on the United States for their extra-European international relations. This involves that for the Europeans, it is going to be harder to pursue separate policies from the United States on issues the United States feels very strongly about. The most important one being China, on which there was, truth to be told, already a transatlantic convergence ongoing before the war, but now the United States will be expecting the Europeans to fall in line. There will be more expectation than persuasion on the part of the United States for the Europeans to follow the US line on China. But another issue is Iran. And here is where the JCPOA negotiations come in. I do not think that the war has damaged directly the JCPOA negotiations. I think these negotiations are faltering because of what Daniela said in the beginning. What Iran wants from the United States now is something the Biden administration is incapable of providing. I would add also that Iran is maybe missing an opportunity here, but this is a matter of personal judgment, and I would like, at least for now, to limit myself to as objective an assessment as possible. So this is the main reason why the JCPOA is very unlikely to be revived. There is not sufficient domestic support in the United States for the Biden administration to decide it wants to risk the political costs of reviving the nuclear deal on the terms the Iranians are putting forward. However, the war in Ukraine has affected the overall environment in which these negotiations are taking place. The Europeans have now less and less room for pursuing a separate diplomacy. The European strategic calculus on the nuclear issue has always been, we as Europeans have our own interests in this deal, but the way we can pursue those interests in non-proliferation, in regional security, is by facilitating US-Iranian nuclear diplomacy, because even if we struck a deal with Iran and the United States were opposed to that, we would not be able to sustain it. And we have seen it that they were not wrong in thinking about that, because the moment the US left the deal, the Europeans were not capable of sustaining it. However, if I think back to 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, when the Europeans started their diplomatic outreach towards Iran on the nuclear dossier, even at the time, we had a very antagonistic US administration, the Bush administration, and nonetheless, the E3 of France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, which was by then still a member state of the European Union, pursued this diplomatic track, and eventually these, this started off the process that eventually led 12 years later to the signing of the JCPOA. And look, the JCPOA is failing just because of the US electoral system, because had Trump not won the 2016 presidential election, in spite of getting fewer votes than Hillary Clinton, we would still have a JCPOA. So let's not forget about contingency in history. But what I wanted to say is that the Europeans many years ago were capable of showing a degree of independence from the United States, which apparently they are not capable of showing right now, even if they have a much more forthcoming Atlanticist-oriented administration in Washington, the one by Joe Biden. So I think that what the Europeans, I think, are trying really their best, but the best right now for me is utterly suboptimal. They are totally unwilling to put pressure on the Biden administration, not just on Iran, but also on the Biden administration. They are totally unwilling to go public about the immense risks that are associated with a total collapse of the JCPOA, risks that, if they materialize, would involve massive costs for regional security, but also for European security. And yet, the Europeans are not making this case out loud in the United States. And the reasons they are not doing that is, on the one hand, they seem, or they pretend to have lost faith in the Iranians, in the Iranian goodwill, but it is also that they do not feel they have any political capital to go to Washington and say, you should do this because it is in the interest of your allies, at a time in which Washington would retort, look, guys, if it weren't for us, you would be facing a Russian army much closer to your borders, to the borders of the European Union. So I think, and this is my last point, I think just not to end with a totally pessimistic and downbeat tone. I don't believe any longer the JCPOA can be saved. I want to believe, I want to hope against my own rational assessment, but I'm not seeing any evidence of that. The only thing that keeps me hoping is that the all players here cannot be that stupid not to realize that whatever comes in a non-JCPOA world will be at best much riskier, at worst much more violent and much more economically damaging than what would come in a JCPOA world. So even if, I mean, this is what keeps me hoping against all evidence. But even if the JCPOA collapses, it seems to me that there is yet little appetite for going beyond what the situation is now, at least in the United States. I think the main purpose of Biden's trip, or one of the reasons behind Biden's recent trip to the Middle East, was to prepare the region for a non-JCPOA world, but also send the message that a non-JCPOA world should not be a world in which the United States is drawn into a conflict with Iran by one of its regional allies, Israel included. Whether that is actually possible, I am not sure. Because in a non-JCPOA world, Iran will continue to advance its nuclear program. There will be not sufficient oversight by the International Atomic Energy Agency to provide a picture of Iran's nuclear advancements that people can point to as a neutral, objective assessment, and therefore we will have to rely on the intelligence of individual countries, and this is an extremely unreliable basis on which to build your own policy. And if Israel starts saying that Iran is a couple of days away from a nuclear bomb and that it needs to act, I mean, I'm not entirely sure the US has the strength to block that process, but I am sure that the Biden administration is sending the message that it does not want to be drawn into a conflict with Iran, and that the US policy after the collapse, the final collapse of the JCPOA, will be continuation of maximum pressure and containment through favoring, facilitating this Israel-Arab sort of alliance, which is, as Daniela says, unsustainable if it weren't for the US guarantee of that. If you take the United States out of the picture, the Israeli-Arab alliance starts eroding pretty quickly. And the Europeans in all this, I'm truly sorry and disheartened to say that, but I don't think they can do much. Still, they can do something. And they can push for the Baghdad talks or similar formats to continue and to include the nuclear dimension there. If there is some sort of nuclear agreement, nuclear arrangements at the level of GCC-Iran relations, you would be, I mean, everything changes, and you could have a new JCPOA become a new possibility. So this is just to end on a not too downbeat note, and I would give the floor back to you, Fatemeh.
Thank you so much for, it was actually a very all-inclusive talk. I wasn't expecting a long one because of your current situation, but I'm really grateful that you provided so much input into the discussion. Throughout your discussion, I was thinking of the other questions, and the one question that I was going to raise before your talk about the US midterm elections, which has, as you mentioned, there isn't much domestic appetite or domestic support for the Biden administration to provide the commitments and the terms that Iran is asking. How would you see the prospects would change after these elections, as of course the speculations so far are not very optimistic. Many believe that the Democrats don't have much chances, but and the Republicans are likely to be leading. And if not even the midterm elections, but also the next presidential elections, the prospects of a return of Trump or another Republican candidate like him, how would that affect all these dynamics that we discussed, the JCPOA, the arms race, and non-proliferation? And of other questions, but I would just want to know your comments and or Daniela's comments on this one, and then I will continue.
Okay, look, I am not sure why the Biden administration, or at least Biden's advisors, have decided that rejoining the JCPOA is domestically damaging. I mean, whatever opposition there is to the JCPOA in the United States is 99% of it is political. It is not based on an assessment of the deal. Even those who criticize the deal from a technical point of view do recognize that the deal had its merits. Perhaps they would have liked something different, but they do not say the deal is bad. They say it's not good enough. But this is a minimal fraction of those who oppose rejoining the JCPOA. The rest of it, that is 99% of it, is political. And they would oppose the JCPOA if the JCPOA had been 20 years longer or had included more limits on Iran's nuclear program and whatever. This is this is a consequence of a political system in the United States which has become so polarized that it tends to oppose whatever the other side does. But there is an addendum to this. This is not just a polarized political issue. This is a polarized political issue in which a powerful constituency has a role. This powerful constituency is the constituency which is very close to Israel and the Saudis in the United States. This constituency is not big in terms of numbers, but it's very influential. And it is very influential in the media, in the foreign policy world, in the foreign policy think tanks world, and it's very influential in Congress. So perhaps what Biden fears is that if he had immediately rejoined the JCPOA, or if he rejoins it now, he would expose himself to continuous attacks, not just from the Republicans, but also from some Democrats. I am not a political analyst, so I cannot say whether Biden's advisors are right. But I mean, for as much as I see it, I think that the American public couldn't care the less about the JCPOA when they go to, I mean, they do have an opinion, but when they do go to vote, they do not think about that. And second, even in 2 years' time, when the presidential Republican candidate attacks him on the JCPOA, he would actually have a platform to say to the American public, look, we tried what this guy is saying. We tried that during the Trump years, and it was really bad from all points of view, nuclear, regional, and ballistic. So I'm not even sure it's really a matter of political calculations. I think that the Biden administration is divided between those who think that it is strategically sensible to have this agreement, like Robert Malley, the Iran envoy, and those who think it is not strategically sensible at this stage to have this agreement, that the US should double down on its allies in Europe, in the Asia Pacific, and in the Middle East. And this is, I think, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, is or Anthony Blinken are two people who thinks like that. And then there is also another issue. I don't think the Biden administration really thinks that the Iranian government is committed to the kind of diplomacy the Biden administration wants them to be committed to, because of the way the Iranian government has behaved during the negotiations. I'm not saying they are right, but I'm saying that it's not just the United States behavior that has raised mistrust. Also, the Iranian government's behavior has not engendered a lot of goodwill among the Europeans and the Americans. But still, let's not forget the text of the deal reactivating the JCPOA has been ready since March. It's not the nuclear issue, the issue on which they're having disagreements. It's the political surroundings of it. And I think the stars are not aligned. We do not have a bold US administration. We have an extremely, a rather rigid or relatively rigid Iranian administration. And so this is why I'm skeptical. And I think that in 2024, whatever Biden does, the Republicans will attack him either because he has rejoined the JCPOA, very low probability for that. But even if he doesn't, they will continue attacking him because he tried. So I don't know. I really hope I'm wrong. 2 years, very long time in politics, especially these times. And I do hope that the Europeans will at least recreate or help recreate some room for diplomatic maneuvering, if not on the nuclear issue, at least on the regional issue, because if the nuclear issue is reintroduced into the picture, but grounded in a regional dialogue, that would be great.
Thank you. Well, I would like to hear Daniela's comments as well, but I was thinking of, from your viewpoints, I was thinking that whether or not there is a possibility of kind of prolonged discussion, a prolonged negotiation. That is to say, negotiations continuing in an endless manner without reaching any, let's say, point that would be a success or failure. Because that was the last 6 months ago, we had, as Riccardo will recall, we had a session with Riccardo and Walter Bosch, and that was his prediction. Walter's prediction was a kind of a similar situation to the the time that Ahmadinejad was government in Iran. Could there be a kind of similar situation this time around till the end of the Biden's administration, or as we are hearing comments from European officials and US officials that the time is limited this time around, that there has to be an end point, whether it's a reliable or a non-reliable. I would like to also know that, if you would.
By me or Riccardo?
If you can, yes, I would.
Yeah, okay. No, well, I think that this round of negotiations will end because the Europeans said everything is on the table now. And so there needs to be a decision on if this is taken or not. I do think that once this will fail, the Europeans will probably think what to do next. And so there might be the proposal for other rounds of negotiations. And I think that's also in the interest of the GCC states, for example. I think we have seen quite clear signaling of both the Emirates and Saudis in that respect. I'm not sure if this current format will then continue. As I said, I think it is actually in the interest of the regional states to have a regionally led negotiations, which the Europeans could support, but I think it should be regionally owned. And now what I generally think is that what my assessment of the Biden administration is that this is an extremely weak administration, as I said before, which has no foreign policy vision for the Middle East at all. It just goes onwards, what it kind of inherited. So I think it would be important to, and the same is for the Europeans. I don't see a vision the Europeans have right now, and I think what Riccardo said in his presentation was quite a correct assessment of European foreign policy, which I can see that, for example, also very clearly, speaking about just yesterday, the Europeans had the Foreign Affairs Council, in which they decided that they will resume again the Association Council meetings with Israel, which they have been put on hold for 10 years because of the repetitive wars on Gaza. So they have been on hold, and the Europeans have resumed them again. Why? I think that they are, aligning themselves simply with the kind of US foreign policy in the region. If you look at the rhetoric of the Europeans, they said, well, we are going to come on board of this kind of new peace initiative. So these kind of normalization process, framing it as a peace initiative. So that's what I see happening in Europe. So there is not really any kind of vision for real peaceful, sustainable, inclusive security architecture in either the US or Europe. And so this can only come from the region itself at this point. But I also do think that the Emiratis and the Saudis are quite aware of the kind of dangerous fallout the collapse of the JCPOA actually implies for the region. What else did I want? Yeah, I think that were my main points. On the issues raised. Yeah, I would actually be also interested in hearing your perspective about this, Fatemeh.
About the future of JCPOA?
About the issues we have been discussing today, the future of the JCPOA and what might come after if it fails.
Yes.
Yeah, if I may add a question, because as Daniela said, we had the Iranian Foreign Minister Amir Abdollahian at YAI, at our institute last week. The discussion was great, was frank. But he refused to engage with the notion of what Iran's view of a post-JCPOA world is. And I mean, I found it on the one hand understandable, because I mean, he did not want to, I mean, I guess it's a delicate issue to talk about, but I was wondering whether you guys think that it is indeed in Iran's interest to let go even a much weaker JCPOA, because you know what is going to happen, that if that the United States wants to blame Iran for the failure to renew the JCPOA, because the deal about the reactivation of the JCPOA is done, and Iran is asking, I mean, is putting forward other requests which are not directly related to the JCPOA, and I fear the Europeans will follow that line of reasoning, especially if Iran continues to advance its nuclear program. So I see immense risks to Iran for this, both economically wise, because I mean, you are missing out on the opportunity to export hydrocarbons, even if it is just for a couple of years, it's still much better. And you know, if you put Iranian oil and gas, especially oil, in the market at this stage, when oil is so much in demand, perhaps it is going to be difficult for our next US administration to again shut the door to Iranian oil export capacity. And there are also security risks, because the risk of a military confrontation grow. So that would be my question. What's your view here? Yes. And as a caveat, as a disclaimer, I do sympathize with the Iranians' frustration at the United States. The US has proven to be the worst negotiator ever, or the one of the most difficult negotiating partner to have. I grant you that. But I mean, if you can go further and tell me what you see as what kind of predicament you think Iran is going into.
Yes. I absolutely understand your concerns. We actually share the same concerns, security-wise and economic-wise, but both domestically in Iran and also regionally. And of course, it's such a, let's say, shame or pity that in these circumstances that perhaps energy has become more prominent, a more prominent factor in global global competition and international system. We are being robbed of this situation. But the issue which is here, the main concern from the Iranian perspective is the lack of trust that you, both of you mentioned at the beginning of your presentations. Of course, there was so much skepticism from the very beginning of these negotiations. And with the signing of the deal, there was so much hope that Iran would be, let's say, be able to bear the fruits of this deal and be able to expand its economic cooperation and follow its strategic goals. But of course, the resistance that followed afterwards from the regional states, the opposition that they had to the deal, the lobbying that went on and then resulted in Trump's withdrawal from the deal. And of course, the 2 years of, let's say, efforts by Iranian administrations, the previous one and this one, the new one, to revive the deal. But of course, not just revive the same deal. Of course, you would understand that we would not be willing to have another deal that can be dismantled instantly by the will or the wish of a US administration, a new US president. And even when the deal was still in place and the US had not withdrawn from it, Iran was not able to benefit from all the terms that were promised. The index wasn't very strong and the sanctions were still in place. And I think at the moment, the main problem that the same situation that exists in the US, the domestic pressure in the US exists in Iran as well. Because if this new administration in Iran just revives a deal which is the same as the previous one, and it's not going to, let's say, be able to grant some economic benefits to the Iranian population and Iran's economy, then how would they be able to convince the public opinion, and also how would they be able to defend their own agendas, explaining that they have done something differently? Of course, they would want to have a better deal, just as the US perhaps from their perspective are looking for that kind of deal. That would, let's say, guarantee the interests of the US security interest. But from our perspective, of course, Iran is after a more sustainable deal, first of all, one that there is a kind of guarantee that it won't be disrupted again. And then secondly, it would be able to trust in the promises that would be kept. And of course, this has not been able to be fulfilled. And the current administration, I don't really know, honestly don't know, I'm not a domestic politics expert. And my studies and my work here is mostly focused on foreign policy and the competition of great powers, the European politics especially. But I don't see, even I can say from even an Iranian citizen, as an Iranian citizen, we are uncertain as well. We do not know what was going to come. And of course, a lot is at stake, domestically, internationally, and regionally, especially. And that's why the concern is going to increase day by day, that these negotiations are delayed, and there's more optimism. And of course, perhaps for Europeans, it would be it's just a question of security interests. But for Iranians, it's not just a regional security, it's the everyday life for us. And so whether or not, I would like to be hopeful, just the same as you, but unfortunately, I am also optimistic, pessimistic, sorry. And just perhaps, as you mentioned, a kind of a regional dialogue could save this situation, security-wise. And economic-wise, of course, Iran is looking for other options with more cooperation with China, Russia, with more regional frameworks like the Asian countries, East Asian countries, Shanghai, and other forms and frameworks of cooperation, which are perhaps more able to put trust in, perhaps. And so, of course, I didn't want to finish on this bleak prospect that I'm, as you mentioned, downbeat note. But we have a few more minutes, about 10 minutes perhaps. And I'm just going to ask my colleagues and all the other participants to see if they have any questions. They can raise their questions, they can raise hands, they can put their questions in the comments. And if not, perhaps we could, let's say, call it a day. Or I wouldn't want to take much of your time. Yes, Daniela, please.
No, first, if someone else has a question, I can say something later, or should I?
Let's see whether there are questions.
Yes, let's see if there are questions.
Yes. It seems that all questions were responded. I had one question about the Arab, the so-called Arab NATO, but we already talked about that. And so,
yeah, if you want to.
We had our previous session was about the Biden's Middle East trip, and we had two guests, just like the two of you, two distinguished guests. Giorgio Cafiero from the Middle East Institute and Dr. Kamrava, an Iranian expert in Doha Institute. And both of them believe that the Arab NATO is an unlikely prospect because there's so much tension and disagreement within the GCC and of course with Arab states and Israel as well. And also logistically, it's not possible yet for the US to create a kind of cohesion between the air defense systems of these countries, which are very different. And even in the long term, I think they did not mention any possible future, let's say, convergence on this issue of Arab NATO. And it was mostly mentioned that for now, the normalization of Arab-Israeli relations would be the main framework of cooperation for the regional states. I was also wondering about that if it would, how you see the future of normalizations. We witnessed that Saudi Arabia, of course, every analyst we've talked to has mentioned that, of course, Saudi Arabia does not have the domestic will to join the normalization. But the little signs of opening the air system and then small cooperations between the companies, we might see signs of future joining of Saudi Arabia. Of course, our guests in the previous session, they believe that some other countries as well, like Jordan, are not very much interested in this trend because domestically they would have opposition to this. I would like to know your opinion on this, your take on this.
Yeah, well, I think that I think actually the same as you said, the other two analysts were thinking about this. I think why, if we compare it to NATO, yes, and NATO has been a quite successful security community, so to say, and that is because there has been a lot of trust between the members of NATO. I think this trust is absolutely lacking when it comes to this kind of Israeli-Arab alliance. And it's actually structural. I mean, if coming from IR theory, yeah, there is this idea that democracies typically trust each other. Why? Because they are transparent. And so you can know what the parliaments are discussing, so they actually trust each other. In this case of this Arab-Israeli alliance, we are not speaking about democracies, and the Israelis are aware that if these Arab states were governed democratically, their foreign policy would look very different. And so I think I think the Emiratis are a particular case because they are a small, very small, very rich country where 80% of the population doesn't even have citizenship. So I think this is a particular case. And Saudi Arabia is a very different case. And if we look at opinion surveys, then the Saudi population doesn't actually want normalization with Israel because of the Palestine question. So I think for the current Saudi government, it would be very difficult to actually formalize this kind of normalization. I think this kind of normalization is going on, but it's not formal. It's not formalized because there would be opposition in the societies. And we can clearly also see that in Morocco, for example, if there have been a lot of manifestations, demonstrations against this kind of normalization, for example, in football stadiums. Jordan, as you said, would have a big problem to, I mean, Jordan has to some degree, of course, already normalized relations because of the peace treaty, but it can only go up to a certain degree, given the large Palestinian population that actually lives in Jordan. And it's not only the Palestinian population in Jordan, which I think would be opposed to that. So I think it's very clear that this this whole kind of alliance is only oriented towards this kind of common threat perceptions these countries have vis-a-vis Iran, particularly in the case of the Emirates here. So yes, I do agree. It doesn't look like something long-term and sustainable to me, and particularly also because it does revolve around this discourse of peace. Yeah, so evoking this kind of Abraham Accords, but there is no peace, and there is continuous violence and wars in Israel-Palestine, and so this will simply continue. So it is very clear to everyone that there is no peace. So that about the Arab NATO, but another issue that I wanted to just throw in to conclude with maybe is for me, looking at the region right now in this current world in which we're living and comparing it a little bit to the 1990s. So in the 1990s, we have this US hegemonic moment, the Europeans sitting on the American train, and it was, and Iran was actually in a very sidelined and weak position, very isolated position in the region. It was in this period that in a way, you know, the US was setting the vision for the region. Very clear, no, with this kind of ideas that it came out with in the 1990s, which failed in the end, yeah, the also peace process, etc. But it was setting the stage. And I think we should remember that we are living in a very different period right now, in a multipolar world where it's not only the US which sets the stage, but in particularly, if we look into the Middle East, then Iran is a quite established, powerful actor right now. And what I think is that it has the capacities now to actually come out with a larger vision for the region too. As I said, this vision isn't coming from anyone else right now. And I think as powerful as military means are, soft power tools like providing security visions for a region are as powerful. And I think it's in the hands of us think tankers actually to also work into such a direction. And so I think that there is thought in Iran, of course, in this direction. I'm remembering the Hormuz peace initiative, etc. But I think even going beyond that and even pushing that forward is very important. And this is what powerful actors usually do. So I think that's something really important for the future of the region. And it's also something that can be thought of in a way, you know, to keep the Europeans kind of in the picture, you know, as being supportive of this. Because if the JCPOA, let's say, fails, what will the Europeans do? The US will focus on sanctions. The Europeans are expected to do the same. But if there is some kind of a regional peace initiative, that they can't really just do that, you know, because there is something that they would need to react to. So I think it would be a very powerful tool to actually react to the current void in the region in this respect.
Yes, I agree. Thank you. Riccardo, if you would like to add any comments.
Yes. On the Arab NATO thing, or Israel-Arab alliance or partnership, whatever. The whole context of the so-called Abraham Accords. I have a slightly different view of those than Daniela, because I do not think that there is one, that I do not think that antagonism towards Iran is the main reason for all countries to have joined the Abraham Accords or to support them from outside, as Saudi Arabia does. I mean, of course, the likes of Morocco and Sudan, they obviously have their own reasons. They do not, that have nothing to do with Iran. I mean, Sudan was given sanctions relief. I mean, it is extremely difficult to get out of the US terrorist blacklists. Sudan managed to do that by formalizing relations with Israel, whereas Morocco got even more because he got recognition by the United States of its own sovereignty over Western Sahara. Again, here is really telling that the US has conceded something to Morocco and Sudan in order to get these two countries do something for Israel. Israel hasn't conceded anything to either Morocco or Sudan. Of course, the US may say it is in my interest that countries join the Abraham Accords framework, but still it's striking to see the superpower making concessions for its own ally. But coming to the countries in the Gulf, yes, antagonism towards Iran is a reason, and I think it's the main reason for Israel. It's a reason for the Emirates and the Saudis too, but I think the most important thing here for these countries is to keep the United States in the region. And while the Trump administration absurdly claimed that thanks to the Abraham Accord, the US would be freer to, disengage from the Gulf and the Middle East, the opposite is the reality. Because precisely for the reasons Daniela and I were discussing before, if you take the United States out of the picture, the whole edifice of the Abraham Accord, it's not that crumbles, but starts looking much less solid, because there is no long-term sustainability to it unless the United States provides that long-term sustainability, which is commitment to the region. Commitment to the region by the United States is extremely important for these countries, not just for security reasons, but, in my opinion, for reasons that are even more important for them, which is regime security reasons. If you get US support, it is much more difficult for your regime to be challenged and contested, and especially forced out of office. So the kind of solidity that a strong US commitment gives is definitely a major asset for especially the monarchic dynasties in the Gulf region. And so this is really important for them. They keep the United States in the region, and they bolster their legitimacy or their solidity. They get weapons from the United States, like the Emirates, which is trying to get these F-35 aircraft. And they also get protection, so to speak, from Iran. So it's a number of reasons, but the most important one is they want to keep the US in the region because they can do a lot with the United States committed to the region, not least for their own regime, long-term stability. Israel, of course, is no monarchy, but it does need US support to advance its political agenda, and especially to, to put the Palestinian issue under the carpet and pretends it doesn't exist, and have other countries in the region, not in the region, in the world, pretend it is actually so. Without US support, without the kind of US commitment they have now, it will be much harder for the Israelis to just pretend the Palestinians do not exist.
Thank you so much, Riccardo. So I think your comments were not very much in disagreement with Daniela's. We're actually complimenting her.
Never in disagreement with Daniela.
Yes,
certainly not on Middle Eastern issues, because I mean, she's the one who knows the region much better than I do. Slightly, or perhaps, I mean, I just wanted to say that the Abraham Accords are not exclusively directed against Iran.
Yes.
Probably for Israel, yes. I'm not entirely sure for the Saudis. I am pretty sure it's not the case for the Emiratis. The Emiratis would like to have a decent relationship with Iran, but what they want the most is that the United States does not leave the region, not least because they are the most exposed.
Yes, I understood your point, yes. And I absolutely agree. So it was a very complete discussion on all regional affairs that are ongoing at the moment. And I really, truly appreciate your participation, especially given the fact that Riccardo was not well.
At my best. No.
Yes. But of course, you appeared the same as our previous session. So there was no change or no, let's say, reduced energy. You were in your full strength. And I also appreciate the fact that you introduced us to Daniela. Of course, she's very well recognized, but we were fortunate to get to know her in this session.
Daniela's the best.
Yes. And hope that we would have her in the next webinars and the future webinars.